Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 60th video discussing British science fiction. In these videos, I've been looking back on the early 1950s from the perspective of 70 years, and I can now see that it was quite clearly a golden age of science fiction for all age groups, from the very young to adulthood. Youngsters could enjoy such comic strips as Superman and Captain Marvel, and a host of indigenous British imitations. The vital bridge to a higher level of appreciation of both the imaginative possibilities of science fiction and the strip cartoon as a graphic art form was provided by Frank Hampson's Dan Dare. Another vital catalyst was provided by Radio Luxembourg's serialized radio version of Dan Dare. The medium of sound coaxing young listeners to exercise their own imagination to visualize the exciting worlds of adventure fantasy. From Dan Dare, the imaginative youngster could then progress to enjoy the science fiction provided by the contemporary novels of John Russell Fearn and Vargo Stanton and others, and to relish their cover art by such accomplished masters as Ron Turner. One could later go on to appreciate more literary and adult science fiction from H.G. Wells and Olaf Stapleton, and more modern masters like Arthur C. Clarke, John Christopher, and John Wyndham, and myriad others. Each of these elements acted as a feeder for the level above it, so that a young boy growing up in the 1950s could pass painlessly from one stage to the next, thoroughly enjoying and absorbing all aspects of the science fiction genre in a seamless progression. That was what made the 1950s so special to me. Bear with me a second. Change of books. By 1956, I was still in transition, yet to discover the full range of written science fiction. However, I was beginning to fall under its sway. I was still enthralled to Dan Dare in the Eagle comic and listening to the serials on Radio Luxembourg. Now, as I've shown in my recent videos, I had been inspired to create my own Dan Dare comic strips, culminating in the massive 850-panel version of the Cerulean Stealers. But as I listened to the next story, I was suddenly moved to interpret it not as a comic strip, but rather as a written novel. Now, it's a written novel, albeit with quite a few colour illustrations. It's Dan Dare, Professor Peabody. Digby. But unfortunately, my adaptation came to an abrupt end after just 8 episodes. The title for this story was The Animated Robots, which I began as a handwritten novel, as we've seen, in a very cheap notebook. As an impoverished working-class schoolboy, it would be several years before I gained my first typewriter. Alas, I didn't complete it. As I've said, I just covered the first 8 episodes. The serial again fell victim to appalling radio static, the worst I'd ever experienced, and although I tried for weeks afterwards, I could never hear a word. And by the time I could hear Luxembourg again, presumably when they gained a more powerful radio transmitter and boosted their signals from Europe, I found that the Dan Dare serials had ended. Although they'd been a great success, its sponsors, Horlicks, had decided to put their advertising monies into television with the advent of ITV. Inspired by watching Wimbledon on television, I'd converted from playing football to playing tennis, which I found I absolutely loved because I was much better at the latter sport, and I soon joined my local tennis club, which had male and female members. I was out every evening and weekend and no longer had any time for drawing or writing. But in the autumn of 1956, when the dark nights and bad weather crept back in, I did have more time at home, and my old urge returned to create my own Dan Dare original comic strip series. And here it is, although this time there were very short stories. The two short stories, which you see there. The first one was entitled By Atoms to Atoms, and the second one was called The Moon Spirit. But now I had a new source of inspiration. Science fiction films from Hollywood had suddenly boomed, and there was a spate of B-movies aimed at teenagers in the mid-1950s. My friends and I, who had long since stopped going to the Saturday morning matinees for kids, were delighted to resume our cinema going, and we lapped up reruns of American science fiction movies at our local Wallsend flea pits, the Royal, the Tyne, and the Queen's. Now, I just watched a film called The Day the World Ended at the Royal, starring Richard Denning, a very competent actor, better known for his role in Creature from the Black Lagoon, which was all about the aftermath of atomic war. Denning and its heroine battled heroically against hideous mutants. Now, we see one of these mutants here in this issue of Nebula, number 15. There was a feature article by Forrest G. Ackerman. And there you see the horned mutant. Now, I was very taken with this film, especially its ending, wherein all the mutants perished in agony when they were caught in a shower of rain. They'd been killed by pure, clean water, the first uncontaminated rain after a long period of radioactive contamination. Scientific nonsense, of course, but I lapped it up. Now, using the Luxembourg formula of the team of Dan Dare, Digby, and Professor Peabody, my story used the same theme. In my story, a planet comes into the solar system, blasted out of its orbit because the inhabitants have had an atomic war, and it travelled through space as a rogue planet. And Dan and company are captured by the mutants. There you see the same horned mutant which I'd seen in the film. But this time, as we see on the bottom panel there, my horned mutants were cannibals, but they came a cropper and died when they were tricked into eating non-contaminated, non-radioactive Earth meats from Dan Dare's spaceship. It was my switch on pure water, pure food killed them. And the wandering world eventually ended up in the sun. So that was that. I then followed this with a story I called The Moon Spirit. Now this was inspired by a short story I'd just read in the British Space Fiction magazine. Number 15, I think it was. And it was a story there. It was called Imperfect Crime by Sheridan Drew. Now that story, the central idea behind that story, what you see there, was of a criminal astronaut whose body is reanimated. The criminal is killed and then his body is reanimated by a mental projection of a malign alien being. Now I didn't know it at the time, but this story had been a reprint and had actually been written by John Russell Fearn under one of his many pseudonyms that I would only discover years later. It had first been published as The Mental Gangster in the August 1942 Fantastic Adventures. You see that story here. There, The Mental Gangster. That's by Thornton Eyre. That inspired my story. Now, there was a note of originality in my story, as we'll see. See there, in the bottom panel. Now, this original note was when Dan kills the alien creature by opening his ship's airlock. He opens the airlock and he blasts the alien out into airless space, where his body bursts apart, which we see there. Now, I drew that in August 1956, fully 2 years before Jeremy Bixby's Hollywood film, It, The Terror from Beyond Space, used the same idea. An idea that was in turn to be later ripped off by Ridley Scott's famous film Alien and television's Space 1999. Alas, I can't sue for royalties because no one has ever seen my unpublished little story. This is perhaps the only instance in science fiction when Dan Dare really did get there first. My version of Dan Dare, that is. That's that one. My final Dan Dare comic strip was a much longer one. It ran to 240 panels. And there's the period it was drawn in. I completed it on the 10th of February 1957. My inspiration for Dan Dare adventuring on Neptune came from my reading of the 1951 Cherry Tree pocketbook by J.M. Walsh, Vanguard to Neptune. See the influence there. If I turn over to the next page. There it is. See that? And that. My inspiration here came from the Ron Turner cover showing a solar ray reflector. And as the story progressed, I also borrowed J.M. Walsh's giant Neptunian birds. Now, throughout 1957, I continued to draw my own comic strips, but I'd finally outgrown Dan Day. I was increasingly inspired by the science fiction paperback books and magazines I was reading at a prodigious rate. Now, at first, I recklessly plunged into trying to adapt full-length novels into my own ambitious graphic novels of my favourite authors and books. But there was now a problem. For one thing, I aspired to be a better artist, and I was no longer content to dash off hundreds of panels at high speed with lots of talking heads. At 15, I frankly considered my early juvenile efforts to be crude and embarrassing. But in striving to create better artwork, each page was taking me days rather than hours. Now here we see the progression of strips that I attempted, but then abandoned as being too time-consuming and difficult. In February 1957, I started The Ray Towers, which was my retelling of Space Hunger as by Charles Graham, who was E.C. Tubb, of course. I did my best to adapt that as a graphic novel. Made quite good progress on it, but then it took longer and longer and more difficult, and gradually I found myself just colouring the bits that interested us, which were usually the goriest bits, or the ones with alien machinery. See there. But gradually, no, it was too difficult. So I then started another book, and this one was based on Operation Venus by John Russell Fearn, where two pilots are flying a plane, which suddenly the engine cuts out and they crash in the Brazilian jungle. But after a couple of pages, I decided, no, that was too difficult, taking too long. Then I was inspired to make a determined effort to do Inferno, a Vargo Statten novel, which I was particularly captivated with. Now here we see my interpretation of that novel. I loved this story, and I managed to complete 21 pages. About half of them in colour. There's the creation of artificial life, which was a favourite theme of Fearn, which I found fascinating, whereby electronic patterns were taken of living people, and then they moulded artificial protoplasm and created exact duplicates, which were robotic. They didn't have any brains. The brains were blanked out, and then the original people could control them telepathically. And I thoroughly enjoyed this story and was cracking along on it, but it defeated me. I just didn't have the time to finish it. But in the autumn of 1957, my imagination was still being energized by the myriad books and films. So I again experimented with trying handwriting my own illustrated stories, which was easier than doing graphic novels. This time, I upgraded my exercise book to the classier Sylvine range with shiny red covers. Now my first story, you see there, was called Invasion of the Worms and was set in the year 2050. Now that ran to 25 pages and was finished, and then I was followed by the sequel, The Life Suckers, set in 2088, and that ran to 27 pages. Just quickly see. Now I could write quicker than I could draw comic strips, but I was still able to illustrate them as I went. Disposing of the bodies in an acid bath. A mad scientist. I'd read that in a Fern novel, which I thought was quite gripping. Murders a woman and gets rid of her body in an acid bath. Interplanetary radio. First man into space. Spaceman becomes transmogrified or transmuted into a monstrous intellectual creature with a giant head and bulging brains. And we'll come back to that, but that was particular significance in that. Now, into these two epic stories, I poured out all the science fiction tropes of the hundreds of comics, books and films that I'd been absorbing for the past 10 years. There isn't time to go through these stories in any detail, and viewers probably aren't interested, but I would like to draw your attention to just a couple of my own original ideas. Now first, I postulated must be this one. Yeah, that one. My first novel idea was that the Earth was surrounded by a radiation belt through which the first man into space, my first man into space, Alan Seisman, flew, and it transmuted him into something superhuman. Now that was 5 years before Stan Lee's Fantastic Four in 1961. And moreover, this was in 1956, and the now famous Van Allen radiation belts around the Earth were not even discovered by Van Allen himself until 2 years later, in 1958. Now, back to this one there. Bear with me. Yeah, this scene here. And here we see my unusual climax, wherein the Venusian worms that are burrowed inside people's brains to control them. There was they creep into people's ears whilst they're asleep and burrow into the head, into the brain. There we see what's in the brain, the Venusian worm that's controlling the woman. Takes telepathic control of her. Now, in my story, the novelty was that the aliens are killed by the heads of the hosts being exploded by my superhuman hero's mental force. Now, such psychically exploded heads would not be seen in science fiction until David Cronenberg's famous film Scanners in 1981, 25 years after I'd first invented the concept. I quote, "Seisman was transmitting pure radiation telepathically, and so the worm brains immediately picked it up with disastrous results. The soft pink nimbus surrounded the heads of the possessed people. The brains were one jangling mass of pain, and then the whole head exploded in a puff of blue smoke. Oh well, I guess I was just born too soon, and so missed out on Hollywood gold."